Well, welcome to the Boston University Institute for Philosophy and Religion's 2024 Spring Lecture Series. I'm delighted to see you all here. I'm David DeCosimo. I'm director of the Institute and a professor here in the School of Theology. The Institute for Philosophy and Religion was founded over 50 years ago by the graduate advisors of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And in founding the Institute, these faculty from the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Religion, and the School of Theology wanted to establish an enduring foothold within the contemporary university for scholars to be able to ask together the most important questions about basic human meaning and existence, questions about friendship and love, about death and loss, questions about ultimate reality, including God and if there is a God and what difference such a God might make. And they wanted to ask these questions in the midst of an increasingly specialized and technically focused university to ask them with intellectual rigor, yet at the same time in ways that opened up the conversation to students and to the general public. And for 50 years now, the Institute has tried to carry forward that mission. And this spring, we turn to a series focused on the question of whether virtue can be taught. And this is a question that is at once perennial and ancient and strikingly contemporary. So just this morning, some of the students who are here right now, together we were looking at the Apology of Socrates, and we listened to Socrates recount the story of his interaction with Callias about whether or not Callias thought that virtue could be taught in relationship to this man's sons. And as Socrates recounts it, Callias thinks, well, of course virtue can be taught. It can be taught by this guy named Avenus, and he does it for only 5 Midas a session. All right? Socrates, for his part, is very skeptical about whether virtue can be taught in that kind of way. And that question has remained present within philosophical and theological conversations for millennia now. And it takes on, I think, a special urgency in our contemporary context. If you're like me, you probably saw at least a clip of some of the congressional hearings where presidents of institutions like MIT and Penn and Harvard were asked about the boundaries of speech on campus and questions that they heard as being technical and legalistic were, I think, fundamentally ethical questions and questions about the relationship between universities and ethical life. That could make us think that the university is supposed to be a site for ethical formation. But at the same time, in promoting this very series on social media, one person responded, universities are the last place that should be trying to teach ethics to anyone. Just look at what's happening. And so those are the kinds of questions that we'll be engaging over the course of this series. Can virtue be taught? If so, what sort of virtues? By whom and how? And our speaker for this evening is a wonderful person to draw us into this conversation and launch it. Dr. Kevin Hector is Naomi Shenstone Donnelley Professor of Theology and of the Philosophy of Religions at the University of Chicago. Professor Hector received his PhD summa cum laude from Princeton Theological Seminary. He received an MA in theology from Wheaton College and completed his undergraduate degree in English and history education at the University of Illinois. Alongside over 24 scholarly articles and several major research grants, Dr. Hector is the author of 3 books. His first book, Theology Without Metaphysics, God, Language, and the Spirit of Recognition, published by Cambridge, draws on Hegel, Wittgenstein, and contemporary pragmatist philosophy of language to tackle the question of how we ought to understand the relationship between human language and ultimate reality. His second book, published by Oxford in 2015, The Theological Project of Modernism, Faith and the Conditions of Mineness, offers an extraordinarily rich and insightful reading of modern philosophers and theologians such as Kant, Hegel, Schleiermacher, and Tillich to explore how these figures construct theologies that both render human life coherent and plausibly count to the person who hold them as their own, rather than something simply received from above or from outside. His most recent book, A New Systematic Theology called Christianity as a Way of Life, was published last year by Yale. In addition to being a remarkable and prolific scholar, Dr. Hector is a devoted and beloved teacher and graduate advisor. In 2013, he won the University of Chicago's Award for Excellence in Graduate Teaching and Mentoring. He is, in my view, the leading philosophical theologian of his generation. And yet, for all this, and speaking personally, what I admire most about Kevin is not his philosophical acuity, his theological creativity, or his historical learnedness, but it's his extraordinary humility, profound generosity of spirit, and authentic kindness. If it is a criterion to teach about virtue that one possess it, then we're in good hands tonight. So please join me in welcoming Professor Hector as he lectures on life-giving hope, virtue, and the things that matter.
That was genuinely too kind an introduction. I almost don't recognize myself, right? Like when you said, come on up, I was like, who? I would add maybe a couple of things so you know me. First, I think it's fair to say you should all call me Kevin, unless that seems weird to you. And the other thing is, you should probably know that more than any of the other academic things, I started off as a high school teacher, and that's just very much still who I am deep down, and it informs some of what I'm going to try to talk about. But let me thank you again for the introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you for maintaining this kind of space. Even the mere fact that it exists is something that I find heartening, and the fact that I get to be part of it is a real joy to me, so thank you. So, as a teacher and as a parent, I spend a lot of my time worrying about young people. One of my worries is that too often, it seems like they don't have available to them a healthy, life-giving way of relating to the future, and that the available and everywhere reinforced ways of relating to the future are in fact toxic. So, for instance, for a lot of young people, their relationship to the future is shaped by anxiety. They have been told from a shockingly young age that they need to make sure that they don't do anything to screw up their future, and that they have to get good grades and participate in certain activities in order to make sure they get into a good college so that they can have a good future, and that they need to get working on these things immediately, and indeed it might already be too late. Parents, teachers, coaches, and tutors endlessly reinforce this message, turning every youth activity into part of a rat race or an arms race whose only goal is getting ahead. There's a article published today in New York Magazine about the consulting industry for preparing students for college applications, and it begins in middle school or earlier, and people are paying upwards of $100,000 a year for these services, and it's not just these 1%ers who are partaking in this, because the mindset that represents trickles down everywhere and gets reinforced everywhere. Small wonder, then, that so many young people feel anxious, nor is it any wonder that so many of them are burned out by the time they hit their 20s, and so why an increasing number of them are deciding to opt out of this whole competition. To be sure, these young people have no shortage of goals and plans, but they often have little hope, since the future looks to them like an endless continuation of the race they have been running since childhood. Many young people also experience a deep sense of defeat in relationship to the future, for the simple reason that the future seems to be definitively shaped by problems that are far too big for them to do anything about. In the face of massive problems like climate change and systemic discrimination, young people often feel like their actions, and indeed their lives, can make no real difference, such that there is not much point in trying. In such a situation, the only kind of action that seems to make sense is to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we all die, or maybe to engage in a kind of purely symbolic protest that calls attention to how upsetting it is that we're all doomed, or that finds someone to blame for that fact. Here, too, young people too often have little hope, since they look ahead to a future seemingly foredoomed by insurmountable problems. Again, it is hard to see how young people could experience a healthy relationship to the future on either of these bases, though I hasten to add that it's completely understandable why they would feel these ways. I don't think these are our only options, however, and in this lecture, I want to consider a different way of relating to the future, namely a way shaped by hope. This is part of a larger project of thinking about what theology might contribute to attempts to navigate our lives in ways that befit what matters to us. The claim I'm developing is that the virtues of faith, hope, and love make people good at doing so, though I intend for this paper to stand more or less on its own. My plan this evening, accordingly, is to begin with a brief analysis of hope and its role in our lives, and then consider what it might mean to direct one's hopes toward a transcendent fulfillment and what difference that might make. The point of doing so, again, is to think about some of the resources theology might have to offer to those who are trying to use religion to help them navigate their lives, and especially how it might help people relate differently and more healthfully to the future. Before proceeding, I need to offer a few quick clarifications. First, I will be focusing on instances of hope for something rather than hope in something. To put one's hopes in something is to count on that thing, which is a phenomenon I treat elsewhere under the rubric of faith. Turnabout is fair play, however, since there are some varieties of faith that I would include in the category of hope. Hence, if someone says something like, "I have faith that we will win this game," I would take that to be an expression of a fairly robust sort of hope, though I recognize that there is overlap between the two concepts. Overlaps notwithstanding, my focus here is on what it means to hope for something, and I'll say more about what that means in a moment. That brings me to a second clarification. When I talk about a life-giving or a healthy relationship to the future, I have in mind a characteristic of a person's agency. In order to lead a life, an agent must be able to do things like plan, imagine possibilities, make promises, follow routines, and do all sorts of other things that orient them toward the future. If our relationship to the future suggests that there is no point in such things, however, then we will literally be demoralized. We will not be able to maintain a sense of agency as we move through our lives. What's more, if we think there is no possibility of fulfillment in the future, or if we cannot experience any satisfaction in such fulfillments, then we will lead a singularly joyless, grinding existence. By contrast, a relationship to the future would count as life-giving or healthy insofar as it enabled a person to maintain their sense of agency vis-a-vis the future and experience some satisfaction or encouragement in it. This should become clearer in due course. One last clarification. In what follows, I will draw on one community's collective memories and traditions, those of Christianity, to provide a clearer understanding of what hope, and particularly hope for a transcendent fulfillment, might look like. To be very clear, my aim here is not apologetic. I am not trying to suggest that if people want to lead their lives well, they should become Christians. I am suggesting, rather, that if we want to get a grip on this virtue and its place in a life well led, it makes sense to consider a tradition that has long reflected on it and sought to put it into practice. Hence, even if people have no interest in orienting themselves toward God, this tradition can give them a clearer understanding of what hope looks like and the role it can play in a person's life. Onward, then, to a brief analysis of hope, which I propose to get off the ground by considering simple cases like, I hope the Bulls win tonight, I hope I get there on time, and I hope you like the gift I got you. On one standard analysis, such hopes are understood in terms of two components, namely a desire that things would turn out a certain way, along with a belief that they could, in fact, turn out that way. This makes sense as far as it goes, for absent desire, one's belief that something is possible could equally be a source of dread or simply food for thought, whereas absent the belief that something is possible, one's desire for it would be mere fantasizing or wishful thinking. Here I think it's worth mentioning that the latter condition, belief that something is possible, explains why hope is usually oriented toward the future, since we cannot hope for something if we already know how it turned out. Notice, though, that futurity is not a strictly necessary ingredient in hope, since it makes perfect sense to say, I hope everyone arrived safely about something that happened in the past, so long as the one saying it does not presently know whether everyone arrived safely. By the same token, just because I want something to happen in the future does not mean I hope that it happens. After all, it makes little sense to say, I hope triangles have 3 sides tomorrow. It doesn't make sense to me, at least, since the 3-sidedness of triangles is certain, irrespective of their futurity. Again, then, what matters is not futurity per se, but my belief that something is possible. Fine points aside, on the standard account, to hope that the Bulls win tonight is to want them to win and believe that it's possible that they would. And they're playing the Raptors tonight, so it's possible. This seems right as far as it goes, but something important is missing from this analysis. To see what this is, consider the fact that someone could want something to happen, believe that it could happen, and yet despair rather than hope. After all, it makes perfect sense for someone to say, I really want this job and think I'm actually a good fit for it, but I know I won't get it. It would appear then that hope involves something more than desire and the belief that something is possible. To see what this additional factor might be, consider Adrian Martin's interesting description of 2 cancer patients, inspired by Martin's work in an NIH clinic, both of whom are participants in an experimental drug trial, both of whom believe that the drug has a 1% chance of being a miracle cure, and both of whom want that to be true. The difference between the 2 patients is that one of them focuses on the 1% chance as evidence that it is in fact possible, whereas the other does so as evidence that it almost certainly isn't. We hear something similar in Ari Meirov's rehearsal of a familiar scene from the movie Shawshank Redemption. Andy and Red both want to escape, and both believe it's possible, yet Red will say, and here I'm quoting Meirov, I grant you it is possible, but the chance is only 1 in 1,000. Whereas Andy will say, I grant you the chance is only 1 in 1,000, but it is possible. Andrew Chignell offers us a helpful way of seeing what these examples have in common, and so what hope's third ingredient might be. Chignell's suggestion, simply stated, is that hope is a matter of wanting something to happen, believing it is possible, and focusing on that possibility as possible. By the same token, if someone wants something to happen and believes it's possible, but focuses on the possibility's unlikeliness, then they lack hope. Not just any such focus will do, however. After all, I could focus on the theoretical possibility of something happening, say drawing a 6 in poker to complete a 3, 4, 5, 7 straight, without thereby having any hope of doing so. What determines whether someone has hope, rather, is the attitude one takes toward a given possibility. If one takes a favorable attitude toward it, an attitude of anticipation or expectation or encouragement, for instance, then one has hope. Whereas if one takes an unfavorable or ambivalent attitude toward it, an attitude of defeatedness perhaps, then one does not. To see what I have in mind here, think of what it means to perceive someone's behavior as offensive. I can do so in a purely objective manner by reviewing the facts and seeing how well they exemplify a standard definition of offensiveness, but I can also do so simply by being offended. In both cases, I perceive the behavior as offensive, but in the latter I do so not theoretically, but by taking up an appropriate attitude toward it. My suggestion here is that a person hopes not simply in virtue of focusing on a possibility as possible, but by taking up a particular attitude toward it, an attitude that says, as it were, yes, this is possible. In taking up such an attitude, one not only perceives the possibility as possible, but does so in what we can now characterize as a hopeful way. This makes sense, I think, and it also sheds some light on a few of hope's other features. Notice, for instance, that perceiving something in a particular way, seeing it under this or that description, can strongly influence how we respond to it. So if I see a dog bounding toward me and perceive it under the description pit bull, I'm likely to respond to it as a potential danger, whereas if I perceive that same dog under the description Paco and Alina's dog Puck, that's my neighbor's dog, I'm likely to respond to it as a big bundle of friendly goofiness, as in fact it is. The way I perceive the dog affects the way I respond to it, which can in turn affect the way the dog responds to me, and so on. In the same way, if I perceive a possibility as possible, I am likelier to respond to it in particular ways, by making plans with it in mind, for instance, and doing things to try to bring it about. Hence, by adding this ingredient to our account, the ingredient of perceiving a possibility as possible, we can not only do justice to hope itself, but can also do justice to the way hope tends to dispose people to act and react in certain ways. We can respond to possibilities not only by acting on them, moreover, but also by dreaming about them, envisioning them, or in some, imagining them. To be sure, we can imagine things without hoping for them, if they are things in the past, obviously, but also if we just don't want them to happen or think they're impossible. Just as we can hope for things without imagining them. So I can have a propositional hope without imagining a corresponding state of affairs, as when I hope that I like my new neighbors without spending any time representing to myself what they might be like. Yet it is not surprising that hope does often involve imagination, since imagination represents states of affairs not present to perception, and hope trades in just such states. We can thus imagine what a particular hoped-for possibility might look like, or what it would be like to experience it, or how the world might be different if it came to pass, or the roads one might need to traverse in order to get to this hoped-for state of affairs. These are all ways of using imagination to fill out one's picture of a hoped-for possibility, though again, one could just as easily perceive it as a picture of something that is not going to happen, and thus despair. There is, though, one particular way of using these representations to focus on a possibility as possible, namely to dream about it. And as we shall see, such dreaming can play an important role in helping us focus on and even derive encouragement from a possibility. So far, then, I have sketched a brief account of one sort of hope, namely the hope that a discrete state of affairs would come to pass, the hope that the Bulls would win tonight, that I would get a particular job, that you would like your gift. Not all hopes are like this, however. We also have more open-ended hopes, as when I hope that 2024 will be better than 2023, or that my kids will be happy, or that I would get a job rather than this particular job. Such hopes are relevantly similar to open-ended questions, by contrast with questions that have a single right answer, which gives us a clue about the meaning of such hopes. On the prevailing account of the semantics of questions, a person understands the meaning of a question only if they have an idea of what responses would count as an answer to it. In the same way, we can understand the meaning of a hope in terms of the state of affairs that would count as fulfilling it. Sometimes it's only one state of affairs, as when I hope that a flipped coin lands on heads. Sometimes it's a delimited range of possibilities, as when I hope to get one of the 10 jobs I applied for. And sometimes it's an unpredetermined set of possibilities, as when I hope that 2024 will be better than 2023, without having a settled idea of what that would mean, or when I recognize some fulfillments only retrospectively, irrespective of what I originally had in mind when I formed the hope. So I was hoping that 2024 would be better than 2023, but I would never have guessed that this would be the year I won a Guggenheim, for instance. I didn't think that was going to make me giggle. As this last example suggests, sometimes our hopes are more open-ended than we realize. Someone might thus think that their only hope is to make it to their 21st birthday. But once they reach that birthday, they discover that that hope is actually part of a larger hope. The hope, for instance, that they could fashion a life that isn't determined by the forces that led them to hope to make it to their 21st birthday. However we describe them, such open-ended hopes are still a matter of wanting something, believing it's possible, and perceiving that possibility as possible, but here the object of hope may include a much broader range of possibilities. With that idea on board, we can now turn to the important phenomenon of hope against hope, by which I mean cases where someone holds out hope even when there seems to be no hope. Sometimes hope against hope is simply a matter of hoping for a miracle. Cases where there is no earthly possibility of something happening, but a person believes in a superhuman power and so continues to hope that it will happen, as when someone hopes a dead loved one will come back to life. These are cases where someone continues to maintain a particular hope in the face of impossible odds. That's distinct from a second variety of hope against hope, where someone remains hopeful despite the fact that they do not know what to hope for, or indeed cannot foresee any good possibilities from their current standpoint. In cases like these, hope against hope is often a matter of maintaining open-ended hope despite not being able to hold any particular hopes, as when someone has given up on a particular career without having any idea what a good next phase might look like, or when someone feels like their entire world has come crashing down and they don't know how to project anything into the future. In such cases, a person can still hold an open-ended hope to the effect that they will find a new career that allows them to put their talents to good use, or that they will somehow be better off after they get through this disaster, despite not having any particular hopes, which is an important way of maintaining hope against hope. Again, though, irrespective of whether a hope is open-ended or directed toward a particular fulfillment, it seems fair to say that hoping involves wanting something to happen, believing that it is possible, and perceiving that possibility in a favorable or encouraging light. This should help us see some of the things that hope can do for us, and in particular, how it can affect the way we relate to the future. First, and most obviously, when we maintain a belief that something is possible and focus on that possibility as possible, it helps us resist the temptation to give up on that thing, even in the face of obstacles and reasons for doubt. It can likewise help us maintain a sense of agency in the face of such obstacles, since it tells us that such obstacles do not have the final word and that there are live possibilities beyond their reach. And this, in turn, can motivate us to act in ways that would make our hopes come true, where they might not have come true if we had not so acted. Hope can thereby become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as can despair. Hope can thus help people resist the temptation to give up on things that matter to them, and thus continue to lead their lives even in the face of setbacks. Hope can also provide people with a kind of sustenance or consolation, and so help them keep going during discouraging seasons of life. People who are grieving often find some strength and comfort in the hope that they will see their loved ones again, for example, just as people who are struggling might find some strength in the hope that someday their struggles will be part of their origin story, in the comic book sense of that phrase. Needless to say, sometimes it's hard to keep going, and being able to find some consolation in one's hopes can help one do so. Consolation isn't the only kind of sustenance one can derive from hope, however. One can also find joy in one's hopes, and sometimes an escape, by inhabiting them in one's daydreams. If I'm working a dead-end job, I might find myself thinking about a vacation I hope to go on, or about my dream job, partly to give my mind something enjoyable to occupy itself with, and partly just to get my mind off the present drudgery. Letting one's mind linger on an agreeable possibility can be pleasurable, after all, and some people might not have many other sources of pleasure in their everyday lives. In such cases, hope can provide people with sustenance simply by bringing them a bit of joy. By providing motivation, consolation, and joy accordingly, hope can help people hold out against demoralization and continue trying to lead their lives even in the face of difficulties. Such help can be multiplied in turn by what we might call the social dimension of hope, though it's worth noting that other people can just as easily make it harder to hope, such as life. We see one version of this social dimension when others help us figure out whether we should give up on a given hope or stick with it, or how to regroup in the face of a setback, or how to give up a hope without giving up hope. We can think of this as a kind of joint discernment of hope. Another social dimension is the phenomenon of shared hope. Sometimes this is just a matter of two or more people independently hoping for the same thing, as when all Bulls fans hope that they win tonight. Sometimes it's a matter of two or more people sharing one person's hope, as when my friend and I both hope he hears good news from his insurance company. And sometimes it's a matter of two or more people, each sharing the other's hope and both having the same hope, as would be the case if my wife and I both hoped to adopt a dog and we both held that hope in our own right and for the other. These are increasingly thick ways of sharing what I would call an interpersonal hope. There are also cases of group hope, where members of a group hold hopes as and for that group, as when conference organizers hope that their conference sparks interest in their cause. In all these cases, hope can be shared, which is important in part because sharing a hope may make it easier for each of us to hold on to it. For one thing, sharing a hope can create social pressure against giving up, and for another, it can provide us with a well of endurance to draw on, a kind of division of labor of endurance almost. For if it is shared, then our hope does not stand or fall with our own individual ability to maintain it. Here again, then, hope can help people resist demoralization, and this help can be multiplied when hope is shared. Supposing, then, that hope is a matter of wanting something to happen, believing that it could happen, and focusing on that possibility as possible, what would it mean for hope to be a virtue? As I understand it, a virtue is a quality or trait that makes something good at or for some purpose. A novel's virtues might thus include interesting, well-developed characters and a plot whose unfolding is earned, yet not entirely predictable, just as a bread knife's virtues might include its serrations, shape, and sharpness. We could multiply examples, but the point is simply that a virtue in this broadest sense refers to a quality that makes something good at what it is for. Notice, though, that as I use the term, certain traits can count as virtues simply because they make something good at being the kind of thing it is. Whatever else you think of them, we might regard breed standards as an attempt to identify what would make a particular dog a good instance of its kind, and so as attempting to enumerate such virtues. When I say that virtues are traits that make something good at or for some purpose accordingly, that should not be taken to mean that the purpose need be something other than being a good instance of a sort of thing. Humans can have all sorts of different virtues, but these count as virtues of character only if they are reliable dispositions to will certain good things, think here of kindness and compassion, or for one's will itself to have certain good traits, think of fortitude and temperance. Following Robert Roberts, Robert Adams, and Kathy Mason, we can distinguish these as motivational and structural virtues, respectively. As I understand it, the virtue of hope is a structural virtue, which is to say that having this virtue means that one's will itself would have certain good traits, not that one would will certain good things. Someone who has the virtue of hope need not have virtuous hopes, in other words. The Thomists are restless. As I understand it, then, if someone has a structural virtue, then their will prove durable over time, even in the face of challenges. This would explain why a serial hoper, the person who buys a lottery ticket one day, applies for a job the next, and asks someone out the day after that, would not count as having the virtue of hope, since none of these hopes is sustained over the long haul. Then again, even if someone held a single hope for a long time, maybe even an entire lifetime, this would not necessarily mean that they had the virtue of hope. For one thing, if their hope endured only because it never faced any challenges, and if it would not have survived such challenges, then its longevity is due to good luck rather than to being a trait of will. And for another, if the hope is not very important to them, then it is a peripheral rather than a structural feature of their will. So, for whatever reason, suppose I hope that I would be the last living member of my graduating class, and suppose I hold this hope until the day I die, even when it seems like it won't come to pass, when I get sick, say, or when I hear that one of my classmates is taking expensive lifespan and extending drugs. By itself, this would not mean that my will is structured by hope. For if this hope doesn't matter much to me, I formed it on a whim, let's say, and I wasn't much invested in it, then it would structure or characterize only a small, unimportant part of my will, and just so would have little impact on my will overall. It would not structure my will itself, which is to say that it would not be a trait or virtue of my will. On the other hand, if someone did hold a hope for a long time, if that hope was important to them, and if it survived various challenges, then I would say that it is a trait that structures their will, and so that it is a virtue. In other words, if one holds a hope over time, and if that hope is central to one's will, then it gives one's will a kind of reliable, enduring shape. It reliably directs one's will toward a state of affairs that one desires, that one believes to be possible, and whose possibility one sees in a favorable light. At a minimum, then, that is what I have in mind when I talk about hope as a virtue. Two brief clarifications of this. First, the fact that hope must be able to withstand challenges does not mean that this virtue cannot be lost. The alternative would be to say that if someone ever loses hope, then they must never have had the virtue in the first place, but this seems too strong to me. For one thing, it would entail that we could judge whether someone had this virtue only after they had died, which runs contrary to my sense that in some cases at least we can spot it among the living. And for another, it seems entirely plausible to me that someone's will could have been structured by hope for, say, 50 years, at which point they find that they can no longer hold on to that hope, or perhaps hold on to any hope. To my ear, at least, it sounds better to say that such a person used to have the virtue of hope, sadly, rather than that it turns out they never actually had it. You may disagree with me on this point, but this is how it seems to me. You can disagree with me on any point, but you're invited to disagree with this. This is related to a second clarification. If someone no longer holds a hope, not because they gave up on it, but because that hope has been fulfilled, then I would say that they do still have the virtue of hope, albeit in a kind of latent state. For they still have the same structure of will, only now it's geared toward enjoyment rather than hope. It's easy to imagine a will so structured being applied to new hopes, particularly hopes for further fulfillments along the lines of one's old hope. Hence, just because one's long-standing hope has been fulfilled, this does not mean that one has lost the virtue of hope, in my book. Clarifications notwithstanding, if someone has the virtue of hope, it follows that their will is structured by an enduring desire for something to happen, belief that it could happen, and favorable perception of its possibility. This would mean, in turn, that someone who has this virtue would be especially good at not giving up on their hopes, and so that they would be especially good at resisting the forces of demoralization. Again, though, the mere fact that one has the virtue of hope does not entail that one has virtuous hopes. After all, one's will could be reliably structured by the hope that one's enemies would be destroyed in a maximally cruel way, for instance. That brings me to the second half of my paper, the last third, really, in which I consider the object of hope, and in particular, what sort of hope might help us cultivate a life-giving relationship to the future. I will drink some water. To give us an idea of what this might look like, I want to consider an Augustinian account of what it would mean to hope for a transcendent fulfillment. By transcendent fulfillment, I mean roughly a hoped-for fulfillment that goes beyond anything one could reasonably project on the basis of present circumstances. As I mentioned at the outset, my reason for focusing on an Augustinian view is not apologetic. I'm not trying to suggest that the logic of hope somehow requires one to hold a hope along these lines. Far from it. My suggestion, rather, is simply that we can learn something by attending to a well-developed example like this, irrespective of whether we ourselves are committed to it. We can reconstruct Augustine's account by proceeding through a few key steps, the first of which is to claim that God is the consummate good, such that every desire is finally a desire for God. On his account, then, it is as if God were to say, I will be their fulfillment. Here I'm quoting Augustine. I will be their fulfillment, God says. I will be all that people rightly desire: life, health, sustenance, plenty, glory, honor, peace, and all good things. We hear something similar from another great exponent of this tradition, Julian of Norwich, who maintains that God is, quote, the endless fulfilling of all true desires. The first step in this account, therefore, is to claim that all of our desires will ultimately be fulfilled in and by God. There are at least a few things that this could mean. It could mean that when a person comes into God's presence, they behold the original of everything that one could desire, the archetype in light of which every other desirable thing can be seen as a kind of pale imitation. This would be akin to someone finally getting to see the Grand Canyon after having long admired pictures of it. Or we could think of it along the lines of comfort eating. When I engage in stress eating or comfort eating, what I want is not the food I'm eating, but the comfort I think I can get by eating it. Hence, if I could get that comfort otherwise, and especially if I could find deeper comfort otherwise, then the desire that originally led me to stress eat would be fulfilled apart from eating anything. In the same way, if what we really want when we want something is God, if God's goodness is the deepest fulfillment of all our desires, then it follows that if we have God, all of our desires would be consummately fulfilled apart from the things in which we originally sought them. We can have such fulfillment in turn, either by simply enjoying the sight of God's boundless goodness, or, perhaps better, by being in a loving communion with God, in the same way that I get to enjoy and find fulfillment in my spouse's thoughtfulness and sense of humor. On these two approaches, then, all of our desires would be fulfilled in God. We can also think of our desires as being fulfilled by God, yet in such a way that this too counts as fulfillment in God. To see what this means, suppose that every desire will be fulfilled in heaven, not simply in virtue of being in God's presence, but by God providing that fulfillment. And suppose further that each of these fulfillments is thus an expression of God's infinite goodness. Hence, a person who has long struggled with illness, and who therefore hopes for health, may eternally enjoy the blessing of health in heaven. In that case, their hope would be fulfilled not because they delight in beholding God's perfect wholeness, but because God has given them health. If this health is God's gift, however, and indeed God's conferral of a creaturely analog of God's own wholeness, then the recipient of this health can see God's goodness in it. The gift is transparent to the giver, as it were, and can enjoy God's goodness in enjoying it, such that finding fulfillment in the gift would lead them to find fulfillment in the giver. Fulfillment by God, in other words, would turn out to be fulfillment in God. This is one way of understanding what Augustine has in mind when he says that in heaven, quote, God will be known to us in such a conspicuous way that we shall each see him by the Spirit in ourselves, in each other, in himself, in the new heaven and the new earth, and in every created thing that will then exist. However we understand it, the point is that in heaven, on Augustine's account, every desire, and therefore every hope, will find its consummate fulfillment in God. This explains, in turn, why heaven is a place of rest. Notice that rest here refers to something more than mere respite for the weary worker, though there is that. But it also refers to the kind of rest a person enjoys when their hopes have been fulfilled. Think here of a case where someone's entire life was oriented toward the fulfillment of a single hope, the hope of making enough money to retire comfortably, say. I have known a few people who have seen that hope fulfilled, and it's interesting to observe that once they do, they're often not sure what to do with themselves, since all of their doing, all of their striving, has now literally reached its end. The only thing left to do, apparently, is enjoy it, though people often have a hard time doing this. However that may be, I take it that heavenly rest is akin to this, which would explain what it means to say, with Augustine, that eternal life, quote, will truly be the supreme Sabbath. Augustine's first move, then, is to claim that all of our desires will be fulfilled in heaven. The second move is to claim that heaven not only fulfills each individual's desires, but fulfills everyone's desires in concert. That it is a single and, as it were, simultaneous fulfillment of all our hopes and desires. The logic here goes something like this. If everyone ultimately desires God, and if everyone's desires are ultimately fulfilled in God, then it stands to reason not only that there would be one big fulfillment of everyone's desires, so to speak, like Oprah's Favorite Things episodes, but that the fulfillment of each would be experienced as fulfillment by others and vice versa. This is easy enough to understand in cases of shared hope, for when I share someone's hope, their fulfillment truly is my own, too. It's not hard to imagine that in heaven all hopes would be shared, because everyone loves everyone else, in which case every fulfillment would be everyone else's fulfillment as well. But we can also understand this simply in terms of loving what someone else loves. If I love music, then if your desire for a lovely tune is fulfilled, I will find that fulfilling too, even if I don't have any personal connection. In the same way, if I love God, then if your desire for some aspect of God's goodness is fulfilled, I will find that fulfilling too, even if I do not first personally share your desire. However we understand it, the point is that heaven is a consummate fulfillment of all desires, not only individually, but collectively, in a rich peace that is characterized not only by an absence of conflict, but by mutuality and harmonious delight in the fulfillments of others. As Augustine puts it accordingly, quote, the peace of the heavenly city is perfectly ordered and wholly concordant fellowship in the enjoyment of God and one another in God. If we share an object of love, then I love what you love and vice versa. Hence, what's good for you is good for me and vice versa. Your fulfillment is fulfilling for me and vice versa. In an endless multiplication of fulfillments, each of which is in harmony with and enriched by every other. On the basis of these claims, we can now take a third and a fourth step. The third step is this. If all desires are ultimately desires for heaven, then it follows that every truly desirable thing will somehow be included in heaven, which provides us with some warrant for using the latter to imagine what a transcendent fulfillment will be like. Hence, after acknowledging that we cannot say for sure what heaven will be like, Augustine emphasizes that we need not, therefore, keep silent about the joy of our hope. With God's help, then, let us offer a conjecture, trying to infer as best we can from the gifts he bestows on good and evil alike in this troubled life, how great the gift will be that we have not yet experienced, and that we certainly have no power to describe as it deserves. In a particularly beautiful passage, Augustine then extols the beauty and the goodness of sky and earth and sea and light and shade and colors and scents and birds and food and health and the coolness of the breeze and on, and then he exclaims, Who could possibly list everything? And all these are only the consolations for the wretched and condemned, not the rewards for the blessed. But if the consolations are so many, so varied, and so great, what will the rewards be? Again, if God is the ultimate fulfillment of all desires, then it follows that all penultimate fulfillments point toward that ultimate fulfillment, which means, in turn, that we are justified in using the former as raw material, as it were, for filling out our imagination of the latter. It's no surprise that poor people often dream of heaven as a place with abundant riches, or that lonely people dream of it as a place characterized by love and intimacy, or that heady types dream of an uninterrupted contemplation of the most interesting things. If Augustine is right, there is nothing wrong with such dreaming, and indeed we theologians should be careful not to look down on those who talk of streets paved with gold, or seeing loved ones again, or frolicking with animals. Quite the contrary. This step is intimately related to a fourth. Indeed, the fourth step is just the flip side of the third, which is to recognize that all earthly fulfillments are approximations or foretastes of an ultimate fulfillment, and so to try to regard them as such. This is what Thomas Aquinas has in mind when he insists that, quote, hope principally regards eternal happiness, and other things for which we pray God it regards secondarily and as referred to eternal happiness. And we hear something similar from Joseph Pieper, who maintains that, quote, all our natural hopes tend toward fulfillments that are like vague mirrorings and foreshadowings of, like unconscious preparations for eternal life. Again, the point here is that if all desires will ultimately be fulfilled in God, then we should experience all earthly fulfillments of desire, including fulfillments of hope, as foretastes of the consummate fulfillment for which we long. For those who put their hope in a transcendent fulfillment accordingly, they should find joy and encouragement in such foretastes, experiencing them as a kind of down payment on their hopes, and so as reassurance that their hope will not turn out to be in vain. Naturally, experiencing them as foretastes means not confusing them with ultimate fulfillment, which is to say that one must be on guard against such confusions. But so long as one sees these fulfillments as pointing beyond themselves, one should find joy and encouragement in every such foretaste, and indeed be increasingly disposed to see foretastes all around. People who set their hopes on an ultimate fulfillment should want not only to perceive such foretastes, moreover, but to create them. To give you some idea of what I have in mind here, consider a handful of examples, beginning with liturgical creations. Sabbath keeping, for instance, which creates a foretaste of eternal rest. Eucharistic celebrations that are supposed to be a foretaste of an eschatological feast, though they often don't resemble that. Worship, which is a foretaste of heavenly delight in God. And liturgical seasons like Lent and Advent, where people practice waiting for a fulfillment that intentionally points them beyond itself. Some works of art, particularly works of art that create something lovely that people can contemplate, be absorbed by, and delight in. Not all art, but some. Art like the paintings of Makoto Fujimura or ornamental gardens likewise create foretastes of ultimate delight. By the same token, the glimpses of communion we create in intimate friendship, for instance, and in at least some erotic relationships, can be a foretaste of the community we hope ultimately to enjoy. Just as political activism can create foretastes of heavenly peace, insofar as it makes the world a more truly harmonious and fulfilling place for all. Gustavo Gutierrez characterizes the latter as a kind of utopianism, which is, quote, the forecast of a different order of things, a new society. Activism based on such a forecast demonstrates that the fellowship which is sought through the abolition of exploitation is something possible, that efforts to bring it about are not in vain, that God calls us to it and assures us of its complete victory, and that the ultimate reality is being built on what is transitory. More, much more, needs to be said about each of these examples, just as we could adduce countless additional examples, but the point should already be clear enough. If all desires are ultimately fulfilled in God, then we should see present-day fulfillments of desires as foretastes of a transcendent fulfillment. This should provide us with encouragement and joy as we hope for that transcendent fulfillment, even as it should move us to create such foretastes. Suppose, then, that someone has the virtue of hope, which is to say that hope is a durable and significant structure of their will, and that they direct their hope toward this sort of transcendent fulfillment. In that case, they would not only be reliably disposed to experience that fulfillment as possible, but would be encouraged to see down payments on that fulfillment throughout their life and to create coming attractions for it. When directed toward a transcendent fulfillment like Augustine's accordingly, the virtue of hope would structure not only a person's will, but their very experience of the world, thereby providing a vastly stronger defense against demoralization and a more life-giving relationship to the future. This raises an important question, however. If what I said at the outset about anxiety and defeatism are right, how would someone ever develop such hope? In particular, how could we help young people do so? I don't have much time remaining, but I want to end the paper by offering a handful of suggestions in response to these questions. First, we need to do our best to help people resist or reject the things that make it so hard to hope. The endless arms races to get ahead, for instance, the endless comparisons with others, and an all-or-nothing approach to solving big problems. These things make it harder to experience joy, reassurance, and a hopeful relationship to the future, so we need to help young people resist these things, and we too need to resist them. Second, I think most young people would be better off focusing on proximate hopes and slowly building up to more ultimate ones, rather than vice versa. Instead of asking teenagers what they want to do with their lives, in other words, we could ask them what they hope to accomplish this school year, or in this class, or this season, and then, over time, help them see how these hopes might point beyond themselves to something larger, hopes for their lives as well as for their character. And in the meantime, we can help them regroup when these shorter-term hopes are disappointed and encourage them to find joy and encouragement when they're fulfilled. Third, it can be helpful to participate in a community of hope, especially one that shares one's hopes and keeps alive collective memories of hopes being fulfilled. Think here, for instance, of communities that regularly pray for the fulfillment of one another's hopes and share testimonies of such fulfillment, or of communities that ritually enact what it looks like to hope even during the darkest times, and to see these hopes eventually prevail, rituals like Passover and Holy Week. I imagine that families and schools can create traditions like these, though it's easier to imagine them practicing something akin to testimonies than anything like Holy Week. Maybe not. Maybe a school of theology can do something like that. Fourth, I mentioned at the outset that I would be focusing here on hope for rather than hope in, but it seems to me that young people will be able to sustain robust hope for the future only if they take it that they do have something to put their hope in. They need something to count on, whether it be themselves, friends, adults, institutions, God, or hopefully all of the above. Again, if they feel like there's nothing that they can put their hope in, it will be almost impossible for them to feel like they can hope for much. So we need to make sure these are things they can count on, and that there are things they can count on, beginning with us. And finally, in response to the question of how someone could ever develop such hope, I think we have no choice but to hope that it's possible. Hope against hope, perhaps, and go from there. Because if we don't hope that it's possible, we're far less likely to try to make it happen, just as we will convey our hopelessness to the very people who need to find a hopeful way of relating to the future. My hope, then, is that this paper gives us some clues about how we might do that.
All right. Thank you very much for the lecture. We have time now for questions. So
Thank you very much for a very stimulating paper. I wonder if you could say something about the question I think that's implicit philosophically in the possibility issue, and that is the specter of false hopes.
Yep.
Right. And you started with some examples of kids and so forth that I think really bring this up. But I was thinking, for some reason, your talk was making me think of examples like Jonathan Lear's account of Chief Plentycoo, who sees that it's a false hope for his tribe to stay on the plains with buffalo, but realizes you've got to move now to a reservation. And it seems to me that I was interested. I guess I wonder how this is a number of different questions, I suppose, but it's a comparative religious question, because it's not clear how foretaste works in an example like that, but how to see that one hope is false, but that the concretization of the things that we as a community have hoped for are present in this other form. I wondered if you could just sort of say a few words about that, about the specter of false hope, one, and then two, the issue of how one can move to a different kind of hope, or reimagine the hope that you have, because it's now a different kind of possibility that we see.
Those are both really great questions, and I'm grateful for both. At least I knew I was leaving certain parts underdeveloped, and the bit about false hopes, or what hopes are reasonable, I mentioned that, right? When we have this joint discernment of, that strikes me as an important thing that friends can do for one another, or wise people can do for one another, help people discern, am I kidding myself, right? Is it time to kind of give up the dream and move on? And if so, who am I and what do I do next? But it's really tricky to give any kind of general answers to the question. I think there are some general answers, right? So there are cases where people are believing things that they think they're possible, but they just clearly aren't. It's just wishful thinking. And that doesn't mean we have to be jerks about it, but it does mean that being a friend means helping people find whatever kind of scaffolding they need to get beyond that hope in a healthy way. And there's other times where, so I was a high school teacher, and people will have hopes, and it's just it's the hope absent any of the kind of work that would, move them toward achieving that hope. And in those kinds of cases, helping them see that that's the case. Like, I think there's some clear examples, but most instances of hope are just not that clear. So here's the example I often think of. We were visiting some dear family in Malaysia, and we were making fondue. The ovens, the stovetops aren't very hot in Malaysia, and so, but we were going to make fondue. It's really a rare thing to be able to make there, so we were making fondue. And the person we were staying with, she said, now it's going to seem like it's never going to liquefy. You just have to keep stirring. And an hour later, I was still stirring, and there was never an empirical time where I could tell myself, now's the time when it doesn't make sense to hope anymore, right? I would still be stirring, right? I will stir until forever, but the facts didn't tell me, right? And hope is often like that. Hope is often, because it has built into it this kind of recalcitrance, and it needs to have a kind of resistance to long odds, but that means it's really hard to know when it's time to give it up, right? And so that's why it often does take discernment, and it's really hard. And so I think it's usually easier to work this out in particular cases, but even then, often it's really hard. And it's also the case that part of the hardness is sometimes there's real grief involved in giving up a hope, and that's hard, and that's part of being a friend. And sometimes it's giving up a conception of yourself. And so it's not just I'm giving up this hope, or I need to move on from this hope, but who am I, right? Like, I've so long shaped myself around this particular hope that I just don't know how to go forward. And so I think it's just a really complicated nest of issues. And so I gestured in the direction of them and didn't say anything really substantive. Your second question was about how we change hopes. Is that
Right. Yeah. The sort of Pleniku example of
Yeah.
seeing something else that consonant with your community but different. And,
Yeah.
Concretized in a different way.
Yeah. And this is, I just briefly mentioned the fact that a lot of times hopes, especially open-ended hopes, but not even, right? So some hopes can be much more open-ended than we realize, even in our holding of them. But they can open up to fulfillments we can only recognize retrospectively as fulfillments of our hopes. And that can be a way that our hopes get shaped in the course of holding them. And that's part of what I take it. So the Pleniku example, Lear has this book, Radical Hope. It's a really lovely book. It's really short and silver. And he gives this really, really moving example of talking about Chief Pleniku, and he's talking about people for whom all of the things that had structured their agencies, the things that they had hoped for, were no longer. Right? They could no longer hunt. They could no longer count coups. The things that they had valued and that they had oriented their agency around were no longer possible. And so Lear makes a lot of this comment that Pleniku makes. After that, nothing happened, because what could happen, right? It's the bad version of the person who gets to retirement and they're like, oh, what do I do now, right? All the things that I've oriented myself toward are over. But what's interesting is, and I take it, Lear and I mean to be on the same page with Lear on this, that there's a way in which the hopefulness without particular objects, it's not totally indeterminate, right? Even if Pleniku doesn't know what it's going to look like, it's not indeterminate, because when these things happen, there's still an openness to them to be able to say, I can see how this radical hope was fulfilled, even though I didn't have anything particular. I couldn't, from where I stood, I couldn't have anything particular in mind as this kind of fulfillment, but now in retrospect, I can see that. And that too can be transformative. I think the comparative example is really interesting, and I don't have anything interesting to say about it, but I think the comparative thread I want to think much more about, and maybe you can push me further on that at dinner if you're willing. That would be great.
Hi. One of the things, as you were describing virtue, I couldn't help but think about virtue abstracted from a particular context being just sort of thought of as positive utility. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit in the context of the virtue of hope, and how we understand that both in a particular context or without context, as just being like a positive sense of utility or something maybe different.
Yeah, would you mind saying more about what you mean by, if it's abstracted from a positive context, or abstracted from a context, it just becomes positive utility?
So I suppose, so as someone who's Christian, there's a sense in which hope for can mean something very specific, and so the utility of hope is grounded in this sense in which there's this relationship with God, there's this relationship with community, with creeds, with all this understanding. There's this world that it lives in. Outside of that, when I think about hope, I'm at a loss for words. And the way you talked about virtue in particular was the sense that it has its usefulness, right? It is, I can't remember exactly what you said. You said a trait that makes something good for what it is for. So if we don't know what it's for,
got it.
What it's this utility, like it's the empty utility, I suppose. So that just was very interesting to me.
No, that's great. And I appreciate the clarification. I think I have a much better sense of now what you're talking about. So I was trying to start with a very broad understanding of virtue that could include everything from bread knives and Great Danes to, virtues of character. And I do think that if we start there, then it does make a certain amount of sense to say virtues are traits that make something good at what it's for, although that can just be being good at the kind of thing it is, right? So a Great Dane can be really good at being a Great Dane in virtue of having, like a kind of square shape and so forth. But it is the case, so I do want to build up an understanding of virtue where it doesn't... I mean, it seems to me that some virtues aren't just like that. Kindness, compassion, right? So motivational virtues, sometimes they're called substantive virtues, right? So the virtues that lead people reliably to will good things, I don't think they're like that, right? I think there's something really useful in a humane sense about being compassionate, but that's not the point of it, right? Whereas structural virtues, virtues of will, make the will have certain good traits, but they could be directed in lots of different ways, right? And so they're not, I don't think hope is inherently a theological virtue, because I could have the virtue of hope and aim it at, I could have that, my will could have that virtue, and I could aim it at something really bad, right? I could hope for something really bad, like cruel, revenge on my enemies, something like that. And so I do want to say that I don't want to bake the goodness of it into the definition of it. I think grace perfects nature here, right? And so it becomes a theological virtue, not in its own right, but once this virtue gets directed to God, then it becomes a theological virtue. Now, I have not told any story about how God might have something to do with the formation of hope that then gets directed to God, right? That's an important part of what it would mean to say in a more robust sense what this would be as a theological virtue. I'm fully committed to telling a story like that. I just didn't do it within the compass of this paper. I think if I had, it might not have sounded so utilitarian to you. But I take the point that starting where I did opens me up to that kind of worry. So I appreciate the question.
I'm going to allocate to myself this question because it's directly related to that one. And it is really picking up on what is at stake for you, or why you would want to call this character of the will that seems not just ethically neutral, but equally open to evil and to good as a virtue. That seems like a very unusual way to think about a virtue, because we would tend to think that possession of virtue would be precisely the thing that made a person a good person. So that, and even on the terms of this idea of a structural virtue, there's an idea of telos or forness, so that something counts as a virtue to the extent that it makes one good for something or at something. And is it your view then that the will doesn't have a telos that is somehow related to human nature? Because typically one would think that there are ends that are in fact constitutive of flourishing or excellence for a human being, and the story about the will would be downstream of that vision of happiness or eudaimonia or goodness for the human being. And those traits of the will that would count as virtues would be precisely those that oriented one well and rightly toward what actually constituted human flourishing.
Mm-hmm.
But on the vision of virtue that you have, or that it seems like you have, it's just as much a virtue of the will for one to be a really hopeful Stalinist or a really hopeful white supremacist as it is to be a really hopeful freedom fighter or a really hopeful person of compassion. So what is at stake for you in wanting to call this thing that can potentially set us up well to do evil persistently and against all odds, why call that a virtue rather than a vice? And how does the question of telos, or the forness of the will, work itself out in your account?
Yeah, that's good. So, I mean, look, if somebody heard this and said, I'd like to reserve virtue for cases where these traits of the will are directed toward actual good ends, it's fine, right? Knock yourself out. For me, it strikes me that what I care about is trying to think about what these traits of will look like, and it strikes me that there are plenty of people who I would say exhibit great courage for the sake of something that I think isn't very good. People who exhibit great hope in something that I think isn't very good, right? So they have these traits, hope, courage, temperance, whatever the traits would be, they have these traits that structure the will, and they can be directed, they can be willed toward different things, right? I want to be able to recognize those things in their native habitat, and then talk about what it would mean for them to be rightly directed, rather than bake the right direction of them into my understanding of the trait itself. I'm also working with, I'm just working with a really lowfalutin understanding of virtue here, right? And so I build up from that to what I think are much more robust moral and theological versions of that. And I think part of the reason for that is because it's just given that my context and what I'm trying to do, starting with the broadest conversation I can and going from there is just a way of, it's just part of my methodological commitment to trying to be hopefully a good colleague in my context.
Hey, thanks for your talk. That was a lot of rich ideas. I had two thoughts. They're not very well formed. They're just sort of invitations for you to say more, I guess. The first is about you start off talking about anxiety and hope, and think of those as contrasts. And I think I was getting myself a little confusing myself or something, because I was kind of thinking about how, on the one hand, I see how they're sort of opposite states or something, but on the other hand, it seems like, in a way, a kind of hope or hoping can be actually an engine or a driver of anxiety. And I guess I'm thinking partly, if you get to the place of giving up all hope or something, a kind of calm can actually set in. You no longer want it, you no longer think it's possible or something. So it seems like in the case of a certain kind of anxiety, at least, it almost feels like there must be a sort of element of hope internal to it. Or you need to sort of want something, still think it's possible, and in a way be fixated on its possibility, for that to so much as then cause you the counter stress of then thinking, but it's probably not going to happen or something. So I think I was just a little puzzled about what the exact attitude the structure of the attitude has to be in those cases. And I was thinking, it doesn't seem like it's quite so, it's not just clearly one or the other. And I'm not sure what to say about that. That was the first thought. And the second thought was more of a sort of cultural reflection, since you kind of started there as well too. I was thinking, it seems like an interesting part of our moment or something, I don't know, that we have both these everything's bad, despairing kinds of things in the culture, or so much dystopian literature, young adult literature, to films as dystopian. But then we also have this other thing, which is right around the corner, AI is going to solve the world's problems in the way that things have never been solved before. Or maybe the end of work is around the corner, and we're finally going to realize the Keynesian dream of a 20-hour work week or something. I mean, there's this other side of extreme optimism, a lot of it's sort of techno-driven, I think, that seems to play there are certain parts of the culture in which that's very prominent. And so I wondered if you just had a thought about that, a way in which we sort of seem to almost oscillate between extremities of a kind of unreasonable hopefulness and what seems to be like an unreasonable utopianism at times in the mouths of some people who have a lot of cultural prestige and standing, to then this other thing of quite the opposite.
Yeah, those are both really good and helpful observations. I mean, I should just say the framing was very impressionistic. And what I was trying to, especially when I talked about anxiety, focusing especially on the way there's a kind of cultivation of a grind mentality, where there's a cultivation of a sense of precariousness and scarcity and a sense of competitiveness vis-a-vis the possible goods, and there's really sort of nothing that one can count on beyond one's own efforts to get ahead. And parents and tutors visit this on their kids and therefore have them, in travel sports with personal coaches and people who are, trying to make sure they get into the best preschools, and they put kids on wait lists for preschools before they're born and hide, like evidence of a new preschool. I mean, it's madness, right? And it's all being visited upon kids. And when I talk to students at U of C, or I talk to my kids' peers, it's evident to me just how much there is. I mean, there is maybe a kind of hope in that, but it's decidedly not a life-giving hope, right? There's nothing in it one could ever rest in, find joy in, and it's combined with a kind of merciless social sorting mechanism that also makes kids feel like there's a machine that is deciding these things, and so by the time they get to their 20s, the machine has told them where they kind of stack up, and their own agency in that also feels a little bit lost in the shuffle. But again, it's very impressionistic. The way I began wasn't meant to be rigorous analysis so much as me talking about something that worries me. I worry about these ways of relating to the future, and my sense is that one of the most interesting things you get if you look at Augustine is these in-between fulfillments, the important place of what I kept calling foretastes, and being able to find reassurance and joy in them. So again, though, it was not rigorous, and I think your point is well taken. The fact that we can have doomism alongside utopianism, sometimes, right, you scroll through social media and you can see them right next to each other. Yeah, that strikes me as interesting, right? So it strikes me some of the utopianism is really clearly an instance of wishful thinking and distraction, but some of it's not. Some of it is a kind of creative way of trying to not let these problems seem so insurmountable. And so I'm down with a certain amount of fictionalizing when it comes to thinking about possible futures. yeah, so I don't mean to suggest that the forces of defeatism are all-encompassing. I think there are all kinds of other. I mean, there's no neat way of talking about the culture, right? Me 1 minute to the next on one issue to the next have different views, and I can't expect much more from a culture.
Thank you for your talk. So I have a question about the objectivity of what is desired and hoped for in relation to the attitude versus status distinction of the attitude of the hoping person versus not only what they're hoping for, but its reality. Like it's so objectivity, reality. Is it something, for example, I could hope to have like a 36-inch vertical. I will never have that. But if you translate that to something more transcendent, like hope in God, etc., like I feel like there is even on a broad kind of inclusive view of hope, that there is an important place for what the object of the hope is, and that I'm also taking your point that you're wanting to take seriously that there's something worth acknowledging about someone having hope, even if they're a hopeful white supremacist or something, where like the sharpness of the knife is still a virtue of the knife, even if it's used to murder rather than like carve something. So I think in the back of my mind, I guess culturally, is something like the prosperity gospel, where you have clear examples of like what I would say is on your definition, a structural kind of hope, and yet there's something sorely lacking in it, even on the I would say on the terms of those that are exercising that hope. This kind of became more of a reflection than a question, but I'm noodling around on the difference between the attitude and status on what's being hoped for, the hoper versus what they're hoping in, and it's the role of its reality. Yeah.
Can you say a couple more sentences about the role of its reality?
I think it was in the third criterion that it's thinking of the possible thing as possible.
Yeah.
And instead of like the glass is half full rather than half empty. There's something about that seems to almost require that they're treating the thing that they think is possible as real or going to be real, such that it's worth pursuing. So I guess I'm asking about the significance of the I want to say reality again, the truthfulness or the I guess maybe even the high probability of the thing that's hoped for actually in fact being the case, something that is achievable. So like Augustine would say that that heaven is something that's I almost said heaven is for real. That heaven is something that is in fact a reality, and and its reality is part of what is the very source of hope itself, right? And so if there was no heaven, or what Augustine is saying is wrong, then where does his account of hope lead, right? So I'm trying to, I guess, what is the significance of the reality or objectivity or truthfulness of the thing that is hoped in?
Yeah.
For the attitude of hope that I'm trying not to like try to get you to do something you're not doing, but still ask about the.
I mean, I'm fine with you trying to get me to do something too, but so I don't think I would put it in terms of reality, because I don't think like I really hope I get such and such job. It is that. It doesn't exist one way or the other yet, right?
That's my situation. Yeah.
What's that?
That's my situation. I'm hoping for jobs that don't exist.
Yeah. Oh. And believing in something's possibility, but not probability, is a perfectly legitimate thing. You can. I mean, let me talk about. I mean, I applied to get a job at the University of Chicago, and I can tell you the odds of me getting the job were maybe 1 out of 100. If they ran that search 100 times, maybe there's one, right? It's like in Endgame when Doctor Strange is like 1 out of whatever. That's me getting the job at U Chicago. But I still had hope, and I think it was reasonable to have hope, not just because I ended up getting the job, but because just because it was low probability didn't mean that it was unreasonable to hope in it. I can be, Andrew Chignell has a really nice point about the fact that you can be a hopeful pessimist, just as you can be a hopeful optimist, right? But you can have low probability estimates and still hope. And I mean, I guess if you have a view according to which future particulars either are or aren't real, you could cash that out, but that's not available to us, right? So in our epistemic situation, the status of these future things isn't, we just don't know it, right? And so the question is, in that epistemic situation, is it reasonable to hope? And it's actually really hard to find criteria that tell us when it is and isn't, that wouldn't give us the wrong answer, right? Like there are times when I would think like, yeah, you should probably give up on that. And then like, oh, guess what? That thing I would have told you to give up on turned out. It went the way you hoped it would. And if you had given up hope, it wouldn't have. If you had listened to me, I would have given you the wrong answer because my general principles would have told you the wrong thing. So I find it really difficult, again, to say anything with all that much certainty. I mean, and even I have to resist the urge to think things like if you really had this lifelong dream of having a 36-inch vertical, and you genuinely dreamed like in heaven you'll have a 36-inch vertical.
I'll be flying in heaven. Yeah.
You'll be flying in heaven, right? It's like
it seemed like that you weren't treating getting that job as such that you just didn't apply, right? There was some possible world like an Endgame that
right.
It was worth attempting. It's that sort of criteria that I'm doodling around.
So I do think this is a place where I am with Kant, right? So Kant's third transcendental, for what may we hope, when is it reasonable to hope? Well, if there are things that I would reasonably be expected to do to put myself in position for such and such to happen, and I'm not doing any of them, then I'm not within my rights to hold that hope, right? I'm just kidding myself. And so, I can hope that I can, play Love Supreme on saxophone, but if I'm never practicing, then I'm just kidding myself. I think that's a pretty clear example of a time when hope is irrational.
All right, we're going to take one last question. Taylor?
Yeah, I can be snazzy quick. Yeah, thank you. That was delightful. I'll talk to you about Doctor Strange later.
Oh, okay, good.
But I got opinions. But I'm going to bring the mood down. I'm so sorry. Apologize. But there's this quote by Slavoj Žižek, and I'm no lover of Slavoj, although he is a Hegelian, so we know we can trust him, for sure. Yeah. But he has this quote in one of his texts where he says that maybe the best thing we can do is see that light at the end of the tunnel is actually a train quickly approaching. And it sounds very nihilistic, but his point is that in this capitalistic machine that we have to grind, we have to move, we have to compete with one another, that perhaps the best thing we can do is nothing, which includes abandoning the hope that there's something to be done, because that very activity is feeding the machine that's killing us. And I don't particularly subscribe to this view, but I think it's a pretty powerful view in the practical circles that he works in, where he's working with leftists and socialists and other kind of mobilizing forces, that there's something right and nefarious about the system itself, that it can adapt to hope, that hopefulness may yet be feeding that thing that hurts us. So I wonder if you could respond to that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a nice point, and I appreciate you raising it. I mean, so first off, I mean, I have granted there are times when there are certain hopes we should give up on. I want to argue that we can do that without giving up hope, which are distinct. But beyond that, my worry. Katrina McKinnon has a really great essay. I think it's called "Against Despair" vis-a-vis climate change, and her point is that it's really tempting to give up hope, and individuals might just not be able to sustain hope and probably shouldn't be blamed for that fact. But if we all counsel one another against hope, Greta Thunberg has decided to come out and said again and again, stop hoping. I want you to quit hoping, right? McKinnon's point is that absent some hope, the kind of creativity and regrouping that is necessary and the ability to sustain a movement without hope, as I have at least spelled it out, not wishful thinking, not optimism, not assuming everything's fine, gang, it's gonna be fine. No, not that. But sustaining hope in the face of the light at the end of the tunnel that's actually the train barreling toward us, means we're in some ways we're just going to hasten our demise at the face of this train. So just as a practical matter, I think McKinnon is right, recognizing that there are times when particular hopes we have to come to terms with the fact that it's just not going to happen. And we have to figure out, how do we regroup? How do we move forward? What do we do about it? So, how do we grieve? So, thank you.
All right, thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.